All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Usually we're picking apart some historical event or um, diving deep on some tech, but today we're doing things a little different.
Bit of a switch up.
Yeah, a switch up for sure. We're going to kind of rewind the clock, go way back, and look at how some of history's, most brilliant minds, these early modern philosophers, were thinking about. Something you wouldn't necessarily think of right away with philosophers. Economics.
Economics. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't usually picture, like, Locke and Hume hunched over spreadsheets.
Right, exactly. But these weren't just guys theorizing from some ivory tower. They were living in the thick of it, trying to understand the economic world around them. And I think that's what makes it so fascinating for us to look back on. They were, like, acting as philosophers in the economy.
Not just philosophers about it.
Totally, yeah. And for our listeners out there, the people who love to, get smart fast, this is like a cheat code. We've boiled down a mountain of these early modern economic thoughts, all the big takeaways, the real aha moments,
Mm.
all without getting lost in the weeds.
No need to go full PhD on it.
Exactly. And look, we're talking big picture stuff here. It's like the foundation of property. What even is money? And then, the whole web of trade, government finances, inequality, what makes an economy fair. You had everyone from Copernicus to Adam Smith, even like huge names like Kant, all digging into these economic questions.
Yeah, it was a big deal for them.
It really was. And the thing to remember is back then, what they called like the science of commerce wasn't this separate thing. It was all tied up in their broader philosophical frameworks. It was an application of their ideas about ethics, society, politics, all of it. So their takes on economics weren't just random opinions. It all flowed directly from their big ideas.
So where do we even start with this? I mean, there's so much ground to cover.
Well, I think one of the most interesting shifts you see in this period is how they start to think about commerce itself. Earlier thinkers, I mean, they kind of looked at commerce suspiciously, didn't they?
Yeah, you could say that. You go back to, like, Aristotle and Aquinas, those guys, they had some pretty downer views on commercial stuff. Aristotle, he worried that chasing profits would, like, warp what things are really for, that it'd turn goods into just tools for making money.
Right. And Aquinas basically agreed. He saw stuff like buying low and selling high as just like built-in trickery. So the big takeaway here is that those earlier thinkers were worried that the goals of economics were getting like corrupted by how people were chasing profit. The means and the ends were getting all messed up.
And that's where things get really interesting in the early modern period. You start to see this new idea pop up.
Yeah.
Due commerce, which is like gentle commerce.
Mental commerce. Okay.
Right. And thinkers like Montesquieu, they were arguing that trade and, going after economic interests could actually make society more civilized.
Yeah.
Yeah. He even had this famous line, something like, where you find gentle customs, you find commerce, and where you find commerce, you find gentle customs. I mean, think about that.
Nah, that is interesting.
Right. The idea is that focusing on mutual gain, both sides winning in commerce, could actually tame our more destructive urges. Like, instead of fighting for power through violence, you're competing peacefully through trade.
So it's not just about getting rich. It's about like making society better as a whole.
Exactly. That's a huge shift from the earlier views, and it's a really important takeaway for us today.
Yeah, it really is. But I'm guessing there were still some pretty big debates, especially about stuff like luxury goods.
Oh, for sure. That opens up a whole can of worms.
Yeah.
What's the ethical side of luxury?
Yeah.
Thinkers like Butler and Helvetius, they definitely saw luxury consumption as, morally questionable. But then you have guys like Mandeville and Hume who completely flipped the script. They're saying luxury can actually drive economic growth and create jobs.
Okay, that's an interesting argument.
Right. Hume even pointed out that stuff we see as luxurious today, like paper, we think of that as basic now, but it used to be a luxury item. And Adam Smith, he wasn't a fan of these sumptuary laws that try to limit people from buying fancy stuff. He saw them as often ineffective or even hypocritical.
So it's like they were weighing the potential moral downsides of luxury against these real economic benefits. It sounds like a tough balancing act.
It was a very nuanced discussion for sure.
Okay, so they're trying to figure out the ethics of commerce. What about this idea that trade can actually promote peace between nations? That seems relevant.
Oh, absolutely. That was a big one for them. You had thinkers like Montesquieu and Hume saying that the more interconnected countries are through trade, the less likely they are to go to war. War becomes too expensive, too disruptive for everyone involved.
Makes sense.
Even Hobbes, famously the life is nasty, brutish, and short guy, he saw potential for peace. through countries becoming dependent on each other for essential goods. And the development of things like the Bill of Exchange, which helped with international transactions that also played a role in building trust between countries, it made cooperation a tangible reality.
But not everyone was totally sold on commerce being this, like, force for good, right? Didn't Adam Smith have a more critical view of things?
Ah, yeah, Smith. He's a fascinating case. On the one hand, he's like the godfather of modern economics, laying the groundwork for how we understand markets. But he was also really critical of, the way merchants and colonizers were acting, especially in his time. He called out their monopolistic and rapacious tendencies, strong words.
Wow, yeah.
He saw the injustices that were happening, especially towards enslaved Africans and indigenous populations, and he didn't hold back. He even said that this constant chase for wealth was often driven by vanity, by this need for approval from others, not by any real need.
So he was seeing the dark side of it all.
He absolutely was. And then there's this famous line about landlords, those who own land, love to reap where they never sowed, which really points to some fundamental inequalities in the system. So yeah, while Smith saw the potential of commerce, he wasn't naive about its ethical pitfalls. He was a really complex thinker.
Okay, so commerce was one big area of philosophical inquiry for them. Let's shift gears a bit to another fundamental concept, property rights and contracts. How did they apply their philosophical lens to these?
Well, this becomes super important in the early modern period, especially as feudalism is fading away and global trade is booming. You have philosophers really wrestling with the very basis of ownership, like what makes something yours.
Right, it's a fundamental question.
Totally. And you get contrasting views, like Hobbes, who was more pragmatic. He said that, essentially, in a state of nature where there are no laws, whoever's strongest gets to control the resources. Might makes right.
But didn't Locke have a different take on that?
Oh yeah, completely different. Locke was all about individual labor and consent being the basis for property rights. His big idea was that when you mix your labor with something in nature, like, you enclose some land and start farming it, you create a right to what you produce from that labor. That's what makes it yours.
So it's about transforming something through your work.
Exactly. And he even argued that this could happen without everyone specifically agreeing to it, as long as there was still enough and as good left for others. He even applied this thinking to inheritance, seeing children as, in a way, extensions of one's own property. It's pretty deep,
Yeah, that's getting into some heavy philosophical territory. What about Hume? He always seemed to have a more grounded, less idealistic perspective on things.
Right. Hume was definitely more pragmatic. He saw property rights less as these inherent natural rights and more as practical agreements that arise out of social needs and what people do over and over again.
So more like it works because it works kind of thing.
In a way, yeah. He pointed out that historically, land ownership often came from conquest and was held in place by power structures, not because of individual labor like Locke was talking about. He drew a distinction between those older ways of claiming land and the changing rules around property in the commercial era, which he saw as getting more tied to representative government and the growth of wealth that wasn't just land. For Hume, having clear rules around property, rules that were stable and predictable, was more important than any abstract justification for those rules.
Okay, that makes sense. And he also got into the nitty-gritty of contracts, right? What were his key insights there?
Yeah, in his big work, The Treatise, Hume really dug into what makes a contract actually work. He said it's not just about clear promises you make, it's also about all these unspoken agreements and, most importantly, trust between people.
So like the social fabric that underpins everything.
Exactly. He used simple examples like neighbors helping each other during harvest to show how these mutually beneficial arrangements can develop just through repeated interaction. And get this, he even saw money itself as a kind of social contract, a chain of pledges that stretches through time and across people. Pretty mind-blowing, right?
It really reframes how you think about something as basic as money. Speaking of which, let's get into the philosophy of money itself. I mean, this is something that feels incredibly relevant to us today.
It really is. And one of the most lasting contributions from this period is the early development of what we call the quantity theory of money.
Okay, break that down for me.
So thinkers like Copernicus, they were seeing all this silver and gold flooding into Europe from the Americas, and they noticed something. When the amount of money increased, the value of that money went down. Basically, the beginnings of inflation.
It's like supply and demand, but for money.
Exactly. And later on, guys like Baden, Locke, and Petty, they fleshed out this idea even further, eventually leading to this more formal equation, MVPT, which basically connects The amount of money floating around, how quickly it changes hands, the overall prices, and how much buying and selling is going on in an economy. Think of it like this. If everyone suddenly had twice as much money, but there was still the same amount of stuff to buy, the prices for that stuff would probably go up.
Makes sense. And then there's that idea that money is neutral in the long run. Where did that come from?
That's mostly Hume again, with his idea of the neutrality of money. He used these thought experiments to argue that if you doubled or halved the money supply overnight, it might cause some temporary weirdness, but in the long run, all it would do is double or halve the prices. It wouldn't really change anything about real economic activity, like how much stuff is being produced or how many people have jobs.
So it's like money is just a way of keeping score, but it doesn't actually change the game itself.
That's a good way to put it. And his specie flow mechanism explained how, when there's an imbalance of precious metals between countries, it tends to sort itself out through trade and the movement of gold and silver. Imagine two connected containers of water. If one has more water, it'll flow to the other until they're equal. Hume even compared trying to hoard gold and silver within a country to trying to dam the oceans. You just can't do it.
Okay, that's a pretty vivid image. But even Hume recognized that in the short term, changes in the money supply could have real effects, right? It wasn't like this instantaneous adjustment.
You got it. Hume was smart enough to see that money isn't always neutral in the short term. When new money enters the economy, it doesn't immediately make all prices and wages adjust perfectly. So it can give the economy a little boost, encouraging people to produce more and potentially leading to more jobs until prices and wages eventually catch up. He even tried to figure out how much the money supply had grown compared to the price level in his time, saying the difference was because of real economic growth.
So they were already dealing with the complexities of inflation and monetary policy, stuff we're still debating today. How did they even try to measure inflation back then? I mean, didn't they not have all the fancy economic tools we have now?
Yeah, it was definitely tricky without the sophisticated tools we have today. But they came up with some clever ways. William Fleetwood, for example, he looked at the price of corn over centuries to see how the buying power of money had changed. Adam Smith also thought using the long-term price of corn measured in silver was a good benchmark because it was relatively stable. And then you have the King-Davenant Law, which was an early attempt to understand the link between how much of a good is available, like corn, and its price. Basically a very early version of how we analyze demand.
Wow, that's pretty impressive for their time. And what about that saying, bad money drives out good? That's Gresham's law, right? Where did that fit into all of this?
Exactly. Back when coins were literally made of precious metals and people could, shave off bits of the metal, Gresham's law explained why messed up coins would stick around while people would hoard the good ones, the ones with all their precious metal.
It was a practical observation about how people act when they have different qualities of money.
So if you have a good coin and a bad coin, you're going to spend the bad one first.
Exactly.
What did these philosophers think about governments deliberately messing with the money supply, like, making the coins less valuable?
They were pretty skeptical of that for good reason. They understood that while, in theory, a ruler could change the money for the good of everyone, it was super risky. It could undermine people's trust in the money and cause inflation, as Jean Bodin pointed out when he was criticizing the French monarchy for constantly debasing their coins.
So they were wary of those kinds of interventions. They were. A good example of this is the Great Recoinage in England, which guys like Locke and Newton were involved in. They were trying to fix the silver content of the coins, but it ended up having all these complicated economic effects, some of which they totally didn't intend.
It's interesting how they were already thinking about the potential downsides of messing with the money supply. And they were starting to explore more abstract ideas about money beyond just physical coins, too, right?
Absolutely. Thinkers like George Berkeley were starting to think about fiat money. That's money that doesn't have its value tied to gold or silver, but instead is based on the government saying it's valuable or on people just trusting it.
Yeah.
Hume, always the big thinker, compared money to language. He said they both work as systems to represent value. Pretty cool, right?
That is a cool way to think about it.
Hume was generally more optimistic about paper money and credit, seeing them as helpful for trade. Adam Smith, though, was a bit more cautious. He famously described paper money as like a wagon way through the air, potentially useful, but you got to be careful, or it could all come crashing down. And they even debated about interest rates. Locke and Bentham were against putting legal limits on them, while Smith had a more nuanced take. But they all generally agreed that over time, interest rates tend to go down as an economy grows and more capital accumulates.
It's remarkable how they were already wrestling with all these complex ideas about money that still feel relevant to us today. This all makes me think about how these early philosophers seem to be working towards a real science of commerce. Were they consciously trying to do that?
They were, definitely. A lot of them were inspired by how successful the natural sciences were becoming, especially after Newton's discoveries.
Hmm.
They wanted to use those same methods of observation and reasoning to understand the moral sphere, which included economics.
So apply that scientific rigor to human behavior.
Exactly. They believed that if they could figure out the basic principles of human nature, they could then uncover patterns that would explain both how economies work and how societies are structured. Hume's work on how we associate ideas and Smith's concept of sympathy were both attempts to get at these fundamental principles.
So it was about more than just armchair theorizing. They were also starting to use numbers and data to make sense of things, right?
Oh yeah, you see the rise of political arithmetic, which William Petty was a big proponent of. He was trying to measure things like population size, national income, and how much money was out there. And commercial math was booming as people developed tools for accounting and all kinds of financial calculations. Plus, you even start to see early forms of decision theory popping up, stuff like Pascal's wager and Bernoulli's work on the St. Petersburg paradox. There were even hints of what we now call game theory in the works of Hobbes and Hume as they analyzed how people make strategic decisions when interacting with each other.
It's like the seeds of modern economics were being planted.
Exactly. And probability theory was taking off in a big way during this time, too. Mathematicians like Christian Huygens and Abraham de Moivre were making huge advances, and this, of course, influenced how people were starting to think about statistics. You have figures like John Arbuthnot and Hume using probability to study things like the ratio of baby boys to baby girls being born and how big populations were. Even seemingly boring stuff like John Grant's work on mortality tables, figuring out how likely people are to die at different ages. And his efforts to spot and remove outliers in the data shows this growing interest in quantitative analysis.
So they were starting to see the power of using data to understand the world.
They were. And you even have early attempts at building economic models, like Francois Quesnay's famous Tableau économique. He was trying to create a visual representation of how income and spending flow through an economy. It's pretty amazing to see these foundational steps towards modern economics being taken centuries ago, all driven by this philosophical curiosity and this desire to make sense of the world around them.
It really is. Now, the last big topic I wanted to touch on is how these thinkers grappled with the idea of distributive justice. How wealth and resources should be shared in a society. Seems like that would have been a hot topic, especially with all these economic changes happening.
Oh, it definitely was. As society was shifting from this feudal system to a more commercially driven one, philosophers were really starting to think about economic inequality and whether it was fair. You see a surge in egalitarian ideas, with thinkers like Locke, Rousseau, Paine, Godwin, and Wollstonecraft all pushing in different ways for a more just and equal society. People like Diderot were outspoken against slavery, and even Hume and Smith were making economic arguments against it, saying that free labor was actually more efficient.
So there was this growing awareness of the gap between rich and poor and a philosophical push to do something about it.
Absolutely. And the rights and interests of what they call the middling sorts, that's the up-and-coming class of merchants, bankers, and manufacturers, became a big focus. Hume, for one, argued that this group was key for future economic growth and would be the backbone of a stable and civilized society. And there were also some increasingly sophisticated discussions about distributive justice on a global scale, with thinkers like István Hont, Gershom Carmichael, and Francis Hutcheson looking at the ethics of wealth disparities between nations. Even the very concept of wealth was changing. It wasn't just about gold and silver anymore. They were starting to recognize the importance of people, their skills and knowledge, and the capital they accumulated.
And Adam Smith, didn't he pay a lot of attention to the working class?
He did, very much so. Smith was a strong advocate for higher wages for workers. He realized that employers often had more power in negotiations and would team up to keep wages low. And he was also sharp enough to see that while specializing labor could make things more efficient, it could also make work pretty dehumanizing for the workers themselves. He worried that they might become as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. He even proposed solutions like publicly funded education to counter those negative effects.
It almost seems strange hearing someone who's often seen as a champion of capitalism being so critical of some of its downsides.
That's the thing about Smith. He was more than just an economist. He was the deep philosophical thinker who really cared about the ethical side of things. He even questioned the whole idea of constantly chasing wealth, pointing out that it often stemmed from a desire for admiration rather than a real need. There's this famous story about the poor man's son who spends his whole life chasing riches, only to find out it wasn't worth the sacrifice of his happiness. Smith was basically saying that a beggar sleeping peacefully by the road might be more content than a wealthy king who's full of anxieties. He believed true happiness comes from within, not just from having a lot of stuff.
It's a good reminder for all of us, I think. So to sum it all up, it seems clear that these early modern philosophers weren't just sitting around debating abstract ideas. They were really engaged with the economic world around them, almost acting as economists with their philosopher hats on, and their ideas really laid the foundation for so much of how we understand economics today.
Exactly. This deep dive shows how philosophical inquiry wasn't just some isolated academic pursuit. It was deeply intertwined with how economic thought developed. And the questions they were wrestling with back then about the ethics of commerce, the nature of property, the role of money, what makes a just economy, those are questions we're still asking ourselves today.
So for our listeners out there, here's something to chew on. How do these early modern philosophers' ideas about these big economic questions resonate with you? Do they make you think differently about how we talk about the economy today, about your own values and priorities?
I think it's definitely worth taking a closer look at the works of these thinkers, even if you don't consider yourself an economics buff. Exploring the history of economic philosophy can give you a much deeper, more nuanced understanding of how our economic world came to be and where we might be headed.
Food for thought for sure. Until next time.
See you then.